Quinn Blake didn't bake because she had a sweet tooth. She baked because the rigid, unforgiving mathematics of pastry offered a kind of salvation. 3 cups of flour, a half teaspoon of salt, exactly 1 cup of unsalted butter. Chilled. In the world of baking, if you followed the rules, you got a predictable, beautiful result. It was a stark, comforting contrast to the chaos of the Helmand province, where rules meant nothing, and the math usually involved calculating the casualty radius of an IED. It was 4:30 in the morning in the quiet, working-class neighborhood of South Boston. Outside, the streetlights cast long, amber shadows across the damp pavement. But inside the Sugared Lily, it was a warm, glowing sanctuary. The air was thick with the intoxicating, heavy scent of proofing yeast, cinnamon, and melting dark chocolate. Quinn stood at the large oak prep table, her hands dusted with flour, working a mound of brioche dough. She kneaded with a steady, rhythmic motion, push, fold, turn. Her hands were strong, the knuckles slightly scarred, the tendons shifting beneath the skin like coiled wire. To the casual observer, she was just a local baker, a 32-year-old single mother with tired but kind hazel eyes, and auburn hair tied up in a messy bun. But if you looked closer, you'd notice the way she stood, weight evenly distributed, perfectly balanced on the balls of her feet. You'd notice that her eyes, even when staring at dough, were constantly tracking the reflections in the front window. It was the muscle memory of a United States Marine Corps Force reconnaissance operator, a ghost from a past life she had desperately tried to bury beneath mountains of powdered sugar. "Mommy?" Quinn's hands stopped instantly. The guarded tension in her shoulders melted away, replaced by a softness that only one person in the world could evoke. She turned to see her 7-year-old daughter, Erin, standing in the doorway of the back office. Erin was clutching a worn-out stuffed bear, her oversized pajamas trailing on the flour-dusted floor. She rubbed the sleep from her big, innocent brown eyes. "Hey, Bug," Quinn whispered, wiping her hands on her apron and crossing the room to kneel in front of the little girl. She brushed a stray curl from Erin's forehead. "It's early. Why aren't you sleeping?" "I had a bad dream," Erin mumbled, leaning her head against Quinn's chest. "I dreamed the loud noises came back." Quinn felt a cold spike of adrenaline in her chest, a phantom echo of mortar fire. But she pushed it down, wrapping her arms tightly around her daughter. "There are no loud noises here, baby, I promise. Just the hum of the ovens and the timer ticking. We're safe here, it's just us." "And the croissants?" Erin asked, a small, sleepy smile touching her lips. "And the croissants," Quinn laughed softly, kissing the top of Erin's head. "Go lay down on the cot in the office. I'll bring you a warm chocolate chip cookie the second the first batch is done." "Deal?" "Deal," Erin whispered, shuffling back into the makeshift bedroom they had set up in the back office. Quinn watched her go, a fierce, suffocating wave of protective love washing over her. Erin was her redemption. After 3 tours, after the blood and the sand and the friends who came back in flag-draped coffins, Erin was the reason Quinn learned how to feel again. She had taken every dime of her military pension, bought this rundown storefront, and built a life where the only thing that bled was cherry filling from a tart. She had sworn an oath to leave the violence behind. But the universe, it seemed, had an ugly sense of humor. By 6 a.m., the sun had crested the horizon, painting the Boston skyline in bruised shades of purple and gold. Quinn had just flipped the sign on the front door to Open, when the little brass bell above the frame chimed. Quinn wiped the counter with a damp rag, not looking up immediately. Morning. Coffee will be ready in just a. She stopped. The air in the bakery changed instantly. The warm, comforting smell of pastries was suddenly choked by the sharp, synthetic scent of cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke. Quinn slowly lifted her eyes. 3 men stood inside her bakery. They weren't the morning commuters looking for a caffeine fix. The man in the center was heavy-set, wearing a leather jacket that strained across his chest. His nose had been broken more than once and set poorly. To his left stood a younger man with jittery eyes and a teardrop tattoo under his right eye. To his right was a tall, lean man with dead, shark-like eyes, keeping his hands buried in the pockets of his dark coat. Quinn's military training initiated a silent, rapid assessment. 3 targets. Heavy set is the talker. Likely unarmed or carrying small caliber in the waistband. The kid is nervous, unpredictable, probably carrying a blade. The tall one is the enforcer, right-handed. Heavy object in the right coat pocket. Likely a .45 or a 9 mm. Distance to door, 10 feet. Nearest weapon, the serrated bread knife under the counter, 2 feet away. Outwardly, Quinn just smiled. It was a polite, customer service smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The heavy-set man sneered, looking around the bakery with exaggerated interest. "Nice place you got here. Sweetheart. Very cozy. Smells good, too. You the owner?" "I am," Quinn said, her voice steady and calm. "What can I do for you?" "I'm Sal. I represent some very influential people in this neighborhood," the man said, leaning his thick forearms on the pristine glass of the display case. His weight pressed dangerously against the fragile surface. "We noticed you opened up a few months ago. Good for you. But, see, you haven't paid your community dues. We provide security. Ensure places like this don't suffer any unfortunate accidents. Protection money. The local mafia." Quinn had heard whispers from the other business owners on the block. But she had hoped they would overlook a tiny bakery run by a single mother. She was wrong. "I appreciate the offer, Sal," Quinn said, her tone perfectly even, "but I've already installed a very good alarm system. I don't need any extra security." Sal chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. He looked at his 2 companions, who smirked back. "Sweetheart, I don't think you understand. This isn't a subscription you can opt out of. Fires happen all the time. Ovens explode, windows shatter." As if to prove a point, the nervous kid with the tattoo casually reached out and pushed a towering display of freshly baked macarons. The tiered stand tipped over, crashing to the floor. Dozens of delicate, pastel-colored cookies, hours of Quinn's meticulous work, were crushed to dust and crumbs against the linoleum. Quinn didn't flinch. Her breathing didn't change. She just stared at Sal. "Leave." The tall, quiet enforcer finally pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing a heavy steel crowbar. Without a word, he swung it in a vicious arc, smashing it directly into the center of the main glass display case. The sound was deafening. Glass exploded outward like shrapnel, raining down over the fresh breads, the eclairs, the tarts. The deafening crash echoed off the tiled walls. "Mommy?" The terrified scream came from the back room. Erin appeared in the doorway, trembling, her eyes wide with absolute horror as she looked at the shattered glass and the strange, threatening men. Time stopped for Quinn Blake. The sound of the shattering glass faded. replaced by the high-pitched ringing of a flashbang grenade. The smell of cinnamon was overtaken by the metallic tang of blood and cordite. The switch she had spent years installing in her mind, the barrier between the mother and the Marine, cracked wide open. Sal looked at the little girl. A cruel, ugly smile spreading across his face. Cute kid. Be a real shame if some of this broken glass found its way into that back room. You got until Friday. Baker. $5,000. Or next time, we don't just break the glass. He spit on the floor, turned, and walked out the door, the bell chiming merrily behind them. His goons followed, laughing into the cold morning air. Quinn stood frozen behind the counter. She didn't look at the ruined pastries. She didn't look at the shattered glass. She looked at Aaron, who was crying silently, clutching her bear. Quinn walked out from behind the counter, her boots crunching over the broken glass and crushed macarons. She knelt down, ignoring a shard of glass that bit into her knee, and pulled Aaron into a tight, desperate embrace. "It's okay, baby," Quinn whispered, her voice eerily calm. "It's okay. They're gone." "Are they coming back?" Aaron sobbed into her mother's shoulder. Quinn closed her eyes. The peace she had fought so hard for was dead. These men didn't just break her windows, they had brought the war into her sanctuary. They had threatened her reason for living. Sal and his crew thought they had intimidated a helpless, apron-wearing baker. They had no idea they had just awakened a monster. "No, baby," Quinn whispered, her hazel eyes snapping open. The warmth in them was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating void of a predator. "They aren't coming back." She kissed Aaron's forehead, stood up, and walked to the front door, locking the deadbolt and flipping the sign to "closed." Then, she walked to the very back of the storage room, past the bags of flour and sugar, and pulled away a heavy tarp. Beneath it sat an olive-drab military footlocker, locked tight for 5 years. Quinn reached up to her neck, pulling a heavy brass key from a chain hidden beneath her shirt. She inserted the key. The lock clicked. She was done baking. It was time to clean house. The olive-drab footlocker smelled of Hoppy's No. 9 gun oil, old canvas, and a past Quinn had sworn was dead. As she lifted the heavy lid, the ambient light of the storage room caught the dull, matte finish of her old gear. There was no hesitation in her hands now, no tremor of fear. The baker who had gently folded brioche dough an hour ago was gone. In her place was Gunnery Sergeant Quinn Blake, United States Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance. She pulled out a black tactical vest, checking the seams and Velcro with practiced, mechanical efficiency. Beneath it lay the tools of her former trade, a customized Glock 19 with a threaded barrel, 3 spare magazines, a surefire tactical flashlight, and a wicked, 7-inch matte black Ka-Bar combat knife. She picked up the Glock, her thumb instinctively finding the slide release. The metallic clack of the slide racking back and forth was a sound she hadn't heard in 5 years. Yet it felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. But before the war could begin, she had to secure her most valuable asset. Quinn locked the footlocker and walked back to the office. Erin was sitting on the edge of the cot, her knees pulled up to her chest, still clutching her teddy bear. Her small face was pale, stained with dried tears. "Hey, Bug," Quinn said, her voice soft, masking the cold fury burning in her veins. She grabbed a small duffel bag and started packing some of Erin's clothes. "We're going to have a little sleepover at Mrs. Higgins' apartment for a couple of days." "Why?" Erin asked, her lower lip trembling. Are the bad men coming back to the bakery? No, sweetie. Quinn lied smoothly, offering a reassuring smile that took every ounce of her willpower to maintain. A water pipe broke when that big shelf fell. It's going to be a messy cleanup. And I don't want you getting your feet wet. Plus, Mrs. Higgins said she's making her famous shepherd's pie tonight. Mrs. Higgins was a 70-year-old Irish widow who lived in the apartment above the bakery. She was tough as nails, mostly deaf, and doted on Erin like a granddaughter. More importantly, her apartment had a reinforced steel door and fire escapes that Quinn had personally inspected months ago. 10 minutes later, Quinn was leading Erin up the back stairwell. Mrs. Higgins opened the door. Taking one look at Quinn's eyes, the hardened, deadened stare that no amount of forced smiling could hide, and understood instantly. The old woman didn't ask about the shattered glass downstairs. She just pulled Erin into a warm hug. "Come on in, lassie," Mrs. Higgins cooed to Erin. She locked eyes with Quinn over the girl's head and gave a solemn, curt nod. "Take as long as you need with those plumbing issues. Dear, we'll be right here, locked up tight." "Thank you, Maggie," Quinn whispered, stepping back down into the bakery. The silence of the empty shop felt heavy. Quinn changed out of her flour-dusted clothes. She pulled on a pair of dark denim jeans, a black, long-sleeved thermal shirt, and a heavy leather jacket that easily concealed the Glock holstered at her hip and the cob bar strapped to her thigh. She tied her auburn hair back into a tight, no-nonsense ponytail, tucked a dark beanie into her pocket, and slipped on her combat boots. It was time to gather intelligence. In the Marines, you didn't charge blindly into an enemy stronghold. You gathered intel. You identified the command structure. You found the weak link and you broke it. The weak link from Sal's crew was obvious. The kid with the jittery eyes and the teardrop tattoo. He lacked discipline. He was trying too hard to look tough. Which meant he was likely at the bottom of the food chain, the perfect source of information. Quinn slipped out the back alley door, dissolving into the mid-morning shadows of South Boston. It took her less than 3 hours to track him down. The neighborhood had its ecosystem, and bottom feeders always swam in the same murky waters. After checking 2 dive bars and a shady off-track betting parlor, Quinn spotted him leaning against a brick wall in a damp alleyway off D Street, smoking a cigarette and scrolling on his phone. He was alone. Quinn didn't announce her presence. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of a ghost. The kid didn't even hear her approach until a hand clamped over his mouth like a vice, and the cold, unforgiving edge of a cob bar pressed tightly against his carotid artery. Before he could struggle, Quinn swept his legs out from under him, dragging him backward into the deeper shadows behind a rusted dumpster. She pinned him to the filthy asphalt, her knee driving hard into his sternum, driving the air from his lungs. "Shush," Quinn hissed, leaning down so her face was inches from his. Her eyes were devoid of any mercy. "Blink if you understand that if you make a sound, I will open your throat and let you bleed out next to the trash." The kid's eyes, wide with absolute terror, blinked rapidly. The tough guy exterior evaporated in a second. He was just a scared kid who had picked the wrong bakery. Quinn slowly removed her hand from his mouth, keeping the knife pressed tight against his skin. A thin bead of blood welled up where the steel met his neck. "You," he gasped, recognizing her. "You're the baker." "I used to be," Quinn said, her voice a low, lethal whisper. "Now, I'm the ghost of Christmas future. You have 10 seconds to tell me everything I want to know. Or you won't live to see lunch. Who is Sal? He's a capo, the kid stammered, tears welling in his eyes. Salva Marzano. Who does Salva work for? Russo. Vincent Russo, the kid choked out, terrified the blade would slip. He runs the whole Southie docks and the protection rackets. Please, lady, I'm just a runner. Sal just brought me along to look scary. You didn't look scary. You looked pathetic, Quinn stated clinically. Where is Sal right now? The scrapyard. O'Bannon's auto salvage on the edge of the harbor. He runs his collections out of the main office trailer there on Tuesday afternoons. Lady, please. How many men does he keep with him? Just the tall guy from this morning. Marcus. Maybe 2 others outside. That's it, I swear. Quinn stared into his eyes, reading his pulse, his pupil dilation, his micro-expressions. He was telling the truth. He was too terrified to lie. You're going to get up, Quinn instructed, her tone freezing the blood in his veins. You're going to walk out of this alley, pack a bag, and leave Boston. If I ever see your face in my city again, I won't ask questions. Do we have an understanding? Yes, God, yes. Quinn pulled the knife away and stood up in one fluid motion. Holstering the blade, the kid scrambled to his feet, slipping on the wet pavement in his haste, and sprinted out of the alley without looking back. Quinn checked her watch. It was 1 p.m. Tuesday afternoon. Salva Marzano was sitting in a trailer, probably counting the money he had extorted from hard-working people. He thought he was untouchable. She pulled the black beanie from her pocket and pulled it snugly over her head. She patted the heavy weight of the Glock at her side. 3 cups of flour, 1 cup of butter. Baking was about following the rules to get a predictable result. War was about breaking the rules until your enemy had nothing left. Quinn turned and walked toward the harbor. It was time for Sal to pay for the macarons. The air around O'Bannon's auto salvage tasted of salt, diesel, and decaying iron. Located on a desolate stretch of the South Boston waterfront, the yard was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass, a fitting battleground for what was about to happen. From the rusted roof of a stacked shipping container overlooking the yard, Quinn had a perfect tactical vantage point. She lay flat on her stomach, her breathing slow and measured, blending seamlessly into the rusted backdrop. The damp afternoon wind bit at her face, but she barely felt it. The switch in her mind was fully engaged. The baker was gone. The operator was at work. Below her, nestled in the center of a maze of crushed sedans, sat a double-wide office trailer. The kid from the alley had been telling the truth. 2 men lounged outside the trailer's aluminum steps. They were smoking cheap cigars, their heavy winter coats doing a poor job of hiding the awkward bulges of shoulder holsters. They were typical street muscle, lazy, completely lacking situational awareness, and entirely unprepared for the violence descending upon them. 2 outside, Sal and the enforcer, Marcus. Inside, Quinn calculated. 4 targets total. Priority. Neutralize the perimeter silently. Quinn slipped over the edge of the shipping container, dropping 12 feet to the muddy ground with the silent grace of a predator. She landed in a crouch behind a rusted-out Ford pickup, the rubber soles of her combat boots absorbing the impact. She drew the bar knife from her thigh holster. The matte black steel swallowed the gray afternoon light, moving laterally through the maze of cars. She flanked the first guard. He was standing near a stack of old tires, tapping ash onto the frozen mud. His back turned to the shadows. Quinn closed the 10-yard gap in less than 3 seconds. She didn't use the blade. These men were just low-level thugs. Her war was with the men inside. As she stepped into his personal space, she drove the heavy, steel pommel of the knife directly into the base of his skull. It was a precise, calculated strike, enough to scramble his equilibrium and shut off his lights, but not enough to crack the bone. The man collapsed like a marionette with cut strings. Quinn caught him before he hit the ground, lowering his dead weight silently behind the tires. One down. The second guard was pacing near the front of the trailer. Looking at his phone, he paused, frowning. "Hey, Tony, you got a light?" he called out, glancing toward the tires. When Tony didn't answer, the man sighed, reaching into his pocket and taking a few steps toward the shadows. "Tony, come on, man." A hand shot out from the darkness, gripping his jacket collar and yanking him violently off balance. Before he could shout, Quinn's forearm locked around his throat in a textbook blood choke. The man thrashed, his hands clawing desperately at her arm. But Quinn's grip was an iron vice. She angled her body, cutting off his leverage. In 6 seconds, his eyes rolled back, and he went limp. Quinn dragged him next to Tony, using heavy-duty zip ties from her tactical vest to bind their wrists and ankles. She shoved rags into their mouths, securing them with duct tape. They would wake up with massive headaches, but they wouldn't be joining the fight. Now, for the main event. Quinn holstered the knife and drew the Glock 19. She chambered a round, the soft click masked by the distant wail of a foghorn. She approached the flimsy aluminum door of the trailer, pressing her back against the corrugated siding. Inside, she could hear the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of a money-counting machine, accompanied by Sal's grating voice. "Tell Russo we're up 8% this month," Sal was saying, his voice muffled through the thin walls. "The new bakery on 4th Street is going to be a gold mine once the bitch pays up. Marcus, make sure you go back there on Friday. If she gives you any lip, break her arms." Quinn's eyes narrowed. The temperature in her veins dropped to absolute zero. She didn't knock. Quinn raised her booted foot and drove a devastating front kick directly into the door's locking mechanism. The cheap metal splintered, and the door flew inward, crashing against the interior wall with a deafening bang. Quinn pivoted into the doorway, sweeping the room over the sights of her Glock. Dynamic entry, speed, surprise, and violence of action. Sal was sitting behind a cheap laminate desk, a stack of bills spilling from his hands, his mouth hanging open in shock. But Marcus, the tall, dead-eyed enforcer from the bakery, was good. In the fraction of a second it took the door to hit the wall. His hand was already diving into his coat. "Gun!" Marcus roared, pulling a heavy .45 caliber 1911. Quinn didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger twice. Pop, pop, the silenced rounds spit from the barrel. The first bullet shattered Marcus's right kneecap. The second tore through his right shoulder. He screamed, dropping the .45 and collapsing to the linoleum floor, a tangled mess of thrashing limbs and blood. Quinn stepped fully into the room, keeping the gun leveled. Sal, panicking, lunged for the top drawer of his desk. "I wouldn't," Quinn said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Marcus's groans like a razor. Sal froze, his hand trembling inches from the drawer handle. He looked up, his brain finally registering the face beneath the dark beanie. The color drained completely from his heavy, scarred face. "You," Sal whispered, his voice trembling. "You're the baker. Sit back in the chair." "Sal," slowly. "Keep your hands flat on the desk," she commanded. Sal obeyed, swallowing hard. The bravado he had shown in her shop was entirely gone, replaced by the primal fear of a prey animal staring down a predator. He looked at Marcus, who was writhing on the floor, bleeding heavily but alive. Who the hell are you?" Sal stammered, his eyes darting to the suppressed Glock. "You're no baker." "I was this morning," Quinn replied coldly, walking slowly toward the desk. She kicked Marcus's drop weapon out of reach. "Before you walked into my sanctuary. Before you broke my glass. Before you terrified my little girl. Listen, lady, we can work this out," Sal pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead. "You want money? Take it. Take all of it on the desk. It's yours." Quinn stopped at the edge of the desk. She looked at the stacks of $20 and $50 bills. Blood money extorted from people just trying to survive. She looked back at Sal, her hazel eyes completely hollow. "I don't want your money, Sal," Quinn said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet register. "I want you to deliver a message." She holstered her firearm and, in a blur of motion, drew her bar. Before Sal could react, she drove the 7-inch blade straight down through the thick meat of Sal's left hand, pinning it firmly to the laminate wood of the desk. Sal unleashed a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, his body convulsing as he stared at the hilt of the knife sticking out of his own hand. Blood instantly pooled across the scattered cash. Quinn leaned over the desk, grabbing Sal by the jaw with her free hand, forcing him to look directly into her dead eyes. His screams hitched in his throat. "You're going to tell Vincent Russo that South Boston is no longer his jurisdiction," Quinn whispered, her breath ghosting over his sweating face. "You're going to tell him that the protection rackets are over. And if he ever sends anyone to my bakery or my neighborhood again, I won't just pin his hand to a desk. I will burn his entire empire to the ground and bury him in the ashes." She released his jaw. "Do you understand the message, Sal?" "Yes. Oh God. Yes, I understand," Sal sobbed, clutching at his pinned arm. "Good." Quinn didn't pull the knife out. She left it there, an anchor of steel and pain, ensuring he wouldn't be moving anytime soon. She turned her back on him and walked out the shattered doorway, stepping out into the cold harbor air. Behind her, the sounds of Sal's sobbing and Marcus's groans faded into the background, swallowed by the wind. The first strike had been landed. Russo would know her name by nightfall. The element of surprise was gone. But Quinn didn't care. She had drawn the battle lines. The baker was officially out of the kitchen, and she was coming for the king. Vincent Russo did not like to be interrupted during dinner. The back room of La Bella Not, an upscale Italian restaurant in the North End, was Russo's sanctuary. The air was heavy with the rich aromas of garlic, simmering marinara, and expensive Barolo wine. The walls were lined with dark mahogany and vintage photographs of Boston's long-gone wise guys. At the center of the room sat a long, heavy oak table covered in a pristine white cloth. Russo was meticulously slicing a piece of veal piccata when the heavy wooden doors swung open. He didn't look up, but his jaw tightened. Standing at 60 years old, Russo was a man carved from polished granite. He had silver hair slicked back immaculately, a custom-tailored Brioni suit, and eyes the color of a winter ocean. He was not a street thug. He was the CEO of an empire built on extortion, gambling, and blood. I explicitly stated, Russo murmured, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone, that I was not to be disturbed until dessert. I'm sorry, boss, truly, but you need to see this. His right-hand man, a giant of a man named Carmen, grunted from the doorway. Carmen stepped aside. 2 low-level soldiers dragged Sal into the room. Sal looked like a ghost. His face was devoid of color. His clothes were stained with mud and oil, and his left hand was wrapped in a thick, blood-soaked towel. He was trembling so violently that his knees gave out, forcing the soldiers to hold him upright. Russo carefully set his silver knife and fork down on the porcelain plate. He picked up a linen napkin, dabbed the corners of his mouth, and finally looked up. Salva, Russo said softly, the quiet tone far more terrifying than a scream. You are dripping blood onto a very expensive Persian rug. Tell me why you are breathing my air right now instead of collecting from the Southie docks. She's a demon. Mr. Russo, Sal whimpered, tears spilling down his bruised cheeks. She came out of nowhere. We didn't even hear her. She took out Tony and Polly like they were nothing. She shot Marcus to pieces. Russo's brow furrowed slightly. Who is she? Salva? The Russian syndicate? The Colombians? No, Sal choked out. The baker. The woman with the shop on 4th Street. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Carmen shifted uncomfortably. The 2 soldiers holding Sal exchanged bewildered glances. A baker, Russo repeated, testing the word on his tongue as if it were poison. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. He walked around the table until he was standing inches from Sal's trembling face. You are telling me, a capo in my organization, that you lost my scrapyard, my enforcer, and my weekly collection to a woman who makes cupcakes? She isn't just a baker. Sal cried, his voice cracking. She's trained, boss, military, or CIA, or something. She moved like a shadow. And she left you a message. A message, Russo said coldly. Carmen reached into his coat and pulled out an object wrapped in a plastic evidence bag. He placed it on the dining table, right next to Russo's wine glass. It was Quinn's matte black bar knife, still coated in Sal's dried blood. Russo picked up the bag, examining the heavy, serrated blade. He recognized the design instantly. It wasn't a cheap street shiv. It was a weapon of war, designed to pierce Kevlar and shatter bone. She pinned my hand to the desk with it. Sal sobbed. She said South Boston is no longer your jurisdiction. She said if you send anyone else, she'll burn your empire to the ground. Russo stared at the knife for a long, quiet moment. He wasn't angry. He was deeply, profoundly insulted. An empire relies on fear. If the city found out a single civilian mother had crippled his crew and sent him a warning, the fear would vanish. The sharks in the other families would smell blood in the water. Carmen, Russo said softly, dropping the bagged knife onto the table. Yeah, boss. Take Salva to the basement. A capo who gets beaten by a pastry chef and lives to pass on her threats is of no use to me. Give him a quick death. He's suffered enough embarrassment. Sal's eyes widened in sheer, absolute horror. No, boss. Please, I warned you. Carmen clapped a massive hand over Sal's mouth, cutting off his screams, and dragged the thrashing man out of the room. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut, plunging the dining room back into silence. Russo walked back to his chair and picked up his wine glass. Taking a slow sip of the Barolo, he looked at the 3 remaining soldiers standing by the wall. "Call Silas," Russo ordered. The soldiers stiffened at the name. Silas was Russo's apex predator, a former mercenary who operated entirely off the books. He didn't just kill people, he erased them. "Tell Silas to take a team of his best men," Russo continued, his eyes locked on the bloody knife. "I want that bakery reduced to ashes tonight. I want the woman brought to me alive so I can peel the skin from her bones. And if she has family, friends, a pet, kill them all. Leave nothing but scorched earth." Across the city, the sun had fully set, plunging South Boston into a freezing, starless night. In Mrs. Higgins' apartment, the heavy blackout curtains were drawn tight. The only light came from a single desk lamp in the corner of the living room. Aaron was fast asleep on the vintage floral sofa, exhausted from the day's trauma, safely tucked beneath a heavy wool blanket. Mrs. Higgins was dozing in her armchair, a cup of cold tea resting on her lap. Quinn sat at the small kitchen table. The transition was complete. Before her lay the disassembled pieces of her Glock, which she was meticulously cleaning and oiling. Her movements were hypnotic, born of thousands of hours of repetitive muscle memory. Beside the gun sat a makeshift tactical map of her bakery and the surrounding alleyways, drawn on a piece of parchment paper. She knew Russo, not personally, but she knew the psychology of a warlord. She had fought men like him in Fallujah and Helmand. They couldn't ignore an insult. They would strike back, fast and overwhelmingly, to make an example of her. They wouldn't wait for morning. They would come tonight. Quinn reassembled the Glock, the metallic clack loud in the quiet kitchen. She holstered the weapon and stood up. She walked over to the sofa, gently pulling the blanket higher over Aaron's shoulders. She pressed a soft kiss to her daughter's forehead, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and innocence. "Sleep tight, Bug," Quinn whispered into the darkness. "Mommy has to go to work." She slipped out of the apartment, locking the reinforced steel door behind her. As she descended the dark stairwell back into the bakery, she didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She knew every inch of this space. It was her terrain now. She walked to the storage room and began hauling heavy bags of flour and sugar to the front of the shop, stacking them beneath the windows to create reinforced firing barricades. She rigged a tripwire across the back alley entrance, attaching it to a homemade flashbang constructed from heavy-duty baking powder cans and magnesium strips. Quinn Blake wasn't going to hide. She was going to welcome them in. She sat behind the flour barricade in the pitch black, the Glock resting on her knee, her breathing perfectly synced with the ticking of the wall clock. Let the wolves come. They were about to step into the den of a lioness. At 2:15 a.m., the streetlights on 4th Street flickered and died. Inside the pitch-black bakery, sitting cross-legged behind a barricade of 50-pound flour bags, Quinn Blake opened her eyes. The sudden darkness wasn't a power grid failure. It was a tactical blackout. They had cut the main line at the transformer down the block. Right on time. Outside, the freezing Boston wind howled through the empty streets, masking the soft, heavy tread of combat boots on asphalt. Silas had brought a fire team of 4 men. They were dressed in sterile black tactical gear, armed with suppressed MP5 submachine guns, and wearing advanced panoramic night vision goggles. To them, the dark street was illuminated in crisp, glowing green. They moved with the synchronized, liquid grace of apex predators. Silas stood in the shadows of the alleyway, raising a gloved fist. The four men stacked up against the heavy steel door at the back of the bakery. Silas was a man who enjoyed his work. He had hunted cartel bosses in Sinaloa and political dissidents in Eastern Europe. When Vincent Russo told him to burn down a bakery and kill a single mother, Silas had almost been insulted. But the bloody bar knife pinned to the desk had piqued his interest. This woman had teeth. Now, it was time to pull them out. He tapped the shoulder of the pointman. Breach. The pointman placed a silent, hydraulic bolt cutter against the padlock of the alley door. With a sickening snap, the lock gave way. The man slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the heavy steel door open. Stepping into the fatal funnel of the doorway, his MP5 raised to his shoulder. He didn't see the thin layer of translucent fishing line stretched taut across the bottom of the doorframe. His heavy combat boot caught the wire. The line snapped. 30 feet away, hidden in the dark, Quinn squeezed her eyes shut and clamped her hands over her ears. Click. Above the doorway, a rigged concoction of magnesium strips and densely packed baking powder detonated. It wasn't a high-explosive frag grenade, it didn't need to be. In the claustrophobic confines of the back hallway, the homemade flashbang erupted with the blinding intensity of a dying sun. For the four men wearing night vision goggles, the sudden, brilliant flash of white light was magnified 1,000 times. The retinas of the pointman and the second operator burned instantly. Contact. I'm blind, the pointman screamed, dropping his weapon and clawing at his tactical helmet as a deafening, high-pitched ringing shattered his eardrums. Quinn didn't hesitate. Before the echo of the blast could fade, she stood up from behind her flower barricade. The darkness was her ally. She had mapped every table, every chair, and every angle of this bakery in her mind. She raised her Glock 19. Two quick, suppressed shots cut through the ringing in the air. Fwip, fwip. The pointman took a 9mm hollow point round to the center of his Kevlar vest, knocking the wind out of him, and the second round caught him just beneath the rim of his helmet. He collapsed backward into the alleyway, dead before he hit the freezing pavement. Ambush! Spread out! Silas roared, ripping his useless, fried night vision goggles from his head and tossing them aside. He raised his MP5 and unleashed a blind torrent of suppressive fire into the bakery. Bullets chewed through the drywall, shattered the remaining glass of the display cases, and tore into the 50-pound bags of flour stacked around the room. A massive, suffocating cloud of fine, white flour dust exploded into the air, filling the entire bakery with a thick, choking fog. It was exactly what Quinn had counted on. She dropped low, crawling swiftly beneath the cash register counter as a hail of bullets shredded the wall behind her. The three surviving operators, including Silas, pushed into the kitchen, coughing violently as the flour dust coated their throats and lungs. They swept their tactical flashlights through the haze, the bright beams cutting through the white dust like lighthouses in a blizzard. "Find her," Silas coughed, his eyes watering. "Check your corners." One of the operators moved toward the large industrial ovens, his flashlight sweeping the area. He stepped on a crushed macaron. From the shadows above the oven hood, Quinn dropped down like a nightmare. She didn't use the gun. In close quarters, a blade was faster. She landed behind him, her left arm wrapping around his neck to silence his shout. while her right hand drove the matte black cob bar deep into the soft gap of armor under his armpit. She twisted the blade, piercing his heart, and lowered his body silently to the tiled floor. 2 down, 2 left. Silas heard the soft thud of a body hitting the floor. He spun around, firing a short burst into the flower-choked darkness. "Marco is down," the third operator yelled, panic finally bleeding into his professional demeanor. He fired blindly into the shadows near the prep tables. "I can't see a damn thing in this dust." Quinn was already moving. She slipped behind the reinforced center island where she usually needed dough. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out an ordinary road flare. The air in the bakery was now completely saturated with aerosolized flour. In the right concentration, suspended flour dust is more combustible than gunpowder. Quinn struck the cap of the flare. It sparked to life, hissing violently and glowing with a hellish, demonic red light. "What the hell is that?" the last operator shouted, aiming his weapon at the red glow behind the counter. "Out!" Silas screamed, his combat instincts instantly recognizing the thermodynamic trap she had just set. "Get out of the building now." It was too late. Quinn tossed the burning red flare high into the center of the kitchen, directly into the thickest cloud of suspended flour dust. She instantly dove behind the dense, heavy bags of sugar she had stacked as a secondary blast shield. The spark met the powder. A thermobaric explosion ripped through the back half of the bakery. A localized shockwave of superheated air and roaring orange flame violently consumed the oxygen in the room. The concussive force blew the back door completely off its hinges and shattered every remaining window in the building. The third operator was caught directly in the blast radius. The concussive wave threw him through the dry wall and out into the alley like a rag doll. Silas, moving with the terrifying speed that had kept him alive for decades, had managed to dive behind a heavy steel refrigerator a fraction of a second before the ignition. The heat singed the hair on the back of his neck, and the shockwave rattled his teeth. But the thick appliance absorbed the deadly force of the blast. The fire sprinklers suddenly shrieked to life, raining freezing water down upon the fiery, ruined kitchen. The air was thick with the smell of burnt sugar, roasted flour, and cordite. Silas lay on the wet tiles, his ears ringing, his tactical gear covered in scorch marks and wet, sticky dough. Slowly, he pushed himself up. He looked around the smoking ruins of the bakery. His elite fire team was decimated, defeated by a tripwire and baking supplies. He raised his weapon, scanning the smoke, looking for the baker. But the room was empty. The ghost had vanished. Silas reached up to his shoulder radio. Pressing the transmit button, he spit a mouthful of blood and ash onto the ruined linoleum floor. "Russo," Silas rasped into the comms, a new, dark respect echoing in his voice. "We have a massive problem. She isn't a baker, she's a hunter, and we just gave her our scent." By 3:30 a.m., a freezing, sleet-heavy rain began to fall over Boston, washing the soot and flour from Quinn's tactical gear as she moved fluidly over the city's rooftops. Down below, the streets were empty, save for the wail of distant sirens responding to the inferno at the Sugared Lily. Quinn didn't look back at the glow of the fire. The bakery was just a building. Her home was tucked safely under a wool blanket in Mrs. Higgins' apartment. Everything else was just a battlefield. She needed Vincent Russo. But warlords didn't just walk the streets, they hid behind armies. To find the king, She had to break the castle walls. And the biggest brick in Rousseau's wall was Carmen. Carmen was Rousseau's right-hand man. The brutal enforcer who managed the syndicate's heavy weapons and illegal gambling operations. Quinn knew from the terrified whispers of the local merchants that Carmen spent his Tuesday nights at the Onyx Room. A highly exclusive, heavily guarded cigar lounge and underground casino in the meatpacking district. Quinn crouched on the edge of a brick parapet, the freezing rain dripping from the brim of her dark beanie. Across the narrow alley lay the reinforced roof of the Onyx Room. Through the skylight, she could see the faint, amber glow of the VIP lounge. She checked her Glock 19. 2 magazines left. She drew the bar, wiping a smudge of Silas's man's blood from the matte black steel against her thigh. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air fill her lungs, slowing her heart rate down to a steady, predatory rhythm. She took a running start, her boots gripping the wet brick, and leapt across the deadly gap between the buildings. She landed on the opposite roof with a soft, controlled roll, coming up instantly into a crouched firing stance. Silence. No alarms. No rooftop sentries. Carmen felt safe here. That was his first mistake. Quinn moved to the heavy steel access hatch. It was secured with a heavy-duty electronic maglock. Instead of trying to bypass the keypad, Quinn pulled a small vial of concentrated thermite paste from her tactical vest, a leftover souvenir from her force recon days. She squeezed a thick bead of the gray paste directly over the locking mechanism, pressed a striker into the center, and pulled the pin. She turned her face away as the thermite ignited with a blinding, white-hot hiss. In 3 seconds, the steel lock melted into glowing, useless slag. Quinn kicked the hatch open and dropped into the suffocating warmth of the building, landing silently in a dimly lit maintenance corridor. The air was thick with the smell of expensive Cuban cigars and cheap perfume. She moved like a shadow, hugging the walls, her weapon raised. As she approached the end of the corridor, she heard the low murmur of voices. 2 guards in tailored suits were standing by a heavy mahogany door, assault rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were talking about the Bruins game, completely oblivious to the death creeping up on them. Quinn didn't use the gun. In an enclosed space like this, even a suppressed shot might alert the main casino floor. She slipped a heavy tungsten steel carabiner from her belt. Stepping out from the corner, she threw the carabiner with the speed and precision of a major league fastball. It caught the guard on the left squarely in the temple with a sickening crack, instantly dropping him to the carpet. The second guard gasped, his hands scrambling to unsling his rifle. He was too slow. Quinn closed the distance in 2 strides. She drove her knee violently into his groin, folding him forward, and followed up with a vicious, crushing elbow strike to the back of his neck. He hit the floor unconscious before his partner even finished twitching. Quinn stepped over them, dragging their bodies into a nearby closet. She took one of their spare magazines, checked her reflection in the polished brass of the door handle, and pushed the mahogany door open. She stepped into Carmine's private office. It was a lavish room, lined with leather couches and racks of top-shelf whiskey. Carmine, a mountain of a man with thick forearms and a broken nose, was sitting behind a massive oak desk. He was aggressively counting bricks of $100 bills, a half-smoked cigar clamped in his teeth. He looked up, his eyes widening as he registered the flour-dusted, Rain-soaked woman standing in his doorway with a suppressed Glock pointed directly at the bridge of his nose. "Don't reach for the drawer, Carmen," Quinn said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Keep your hands on the money." Carmen froze, but a cruel, arrogant smirk slowly spread across his face. "So, you're the baker Silas just called the boss. Said you blew up your own shop. You got stones. Lady, I'll give you that, but you're an idiot for coming here. I got 30 armed men downstairs. If I yell, you'll look like Swiss cheese in 5 seconds." "If you yell," Quinn replied, stepping into the room and locking the heavy door behind her, "you'll be dead in 1. And 30 men without a leader are just targets." Carmen scoffed, shifting his weight slightly. "What do you want? Money? Sal was a moron. You want a piece of the action. Maybe we can work something out." "I want Vincent Russo," Quinn said, moving closer, her eyes locked on his. "Give me his location." "Russo? You're out of your mind." Carmen laughed, though it sounded forced. "Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell a dead woman walking." Suddenly, Carmen lunged forward, grabbing a heavy glass ashtray from the desk and hurling it at Quinn's head, while his other hand dove toward his ankle holster. Quinn didn't flinch. She sidestepped the heavy glass easily, before Carmine's hand could even brush his concealed revolver. Quinn fired. Peefed. The 9mm hollow point shattered Carmine's right wrist. He roared in agony, falling back into his leather chair, clutching his mangled, bleeding arm. Quinn was over the desk in a flash. She grabbed Carmen by the lapels of his expensive suit, dragging his massive frame halfway across the desk, and jammed the scorching hot suppressor of her Glock directly under his chin. The smell of burning flesh and singed beard hair filled the air. "I don't have time to play Mafia games with you, Carmen," Quinn whispered, her eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "My daughter was crying this morning because of your men. Every second you waste is a second I make you suffer." "Where is Russo?" Carmen gasped, tears of pain mixing with the sweat on his face. The arrogance was completely shattered. He looked into Quinn's eyes and saw no hesitation. He saw a soldier who had crossed the point of no return. "Weston," Carmen choked out, his voice a pathetic squeak. "He's at his estate in Weston. It's a fortress, you can't get in. Silas is there. Silas is gathering all the men." "Address," Quinn commanded, pressing the hot metal harder into his throat. 440 Blackwood Lane. It's an old compound, walled off. Please, lady, I need a doctor." Quinn stared at him for a long moment, memorizing the intelligence. A fortified compound, an army of mercenaries led by Silas. It was a suicide mission for a normal person. But Quinn wasn't normal. She pulled the gun away from his chin. Carmen let out a sobbing gasp of relief. Without a word, Quinn whipped the heavy polymer grip of her pistol across his temple. Carmine's eyes rolled back, and he slumped heavily onto his bloody desk, completely unconscious. Quinn turned and walked back to the window, sliding it open to the freezing rain. She looked out toward the western suburbs of Boston. Vincent Russo had built a fortress to keep the world out. But a fortress is just a cage when the predator is already inside your head. Quinn climbed out onto the fire escape, vanishing back into the stormy night. It was time to finish the war. The digital clock on the dashboard of Quinn's stolen dark gray sedan read 4:15 a.m. The freezing rain had turned into a steady, punishing downpour, turning the winding, tree-lined roads of Weston, Massachusetts, into slick black rivers. Weston was where old money hid. It was a town of sprawling estates, manicured lawns, and high iron gates. But at 440 Blackwood Lane, Vincent Russo had built something else entirely. He had built a heavily fortified compound disguised as a luxury mansion. Before heading to Weston, Quinn had made a brief detour to a climate-controlled storage facility off Interstate 95. Rented under a fake name 5 years ago, Unit 404 held the insurance policy she prayed she would never have to cash out. Now, that policy was strapped to her chest. Gone was the simple leather jacket. Quinn was now encased in a sleek, black tactical plate carrier equipped with Level 4 ceramic ballistic plates, capable of stopping armor-piercing rifle rounds. Across her chest were 6 spare magazines. Slung tight against her shoulder was a heavily modified Daniel Defense Mk18 short-barreled rifle. It was outfitted with an EOTech holographic sight, an angled foregrip, and a customized SOCOM suppressor. It was a weapon designed for one specific purpose: devastating, overwhelming lethality in close-quarters combat. She pulled the sedan onto a muddy, unpaved utility road a half-mile from the estate, killing the headlights and the engine. The silence of the woods was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof. Quinn stepped out into the storm, her boots sinking slightly into the freezing mud. She pulled a pair of advanced, quad-tube night vision goggles, NVGs, down over her eyes. The dark, rain-soaked forest instantly transformed into a crisp, glowing green landscape. She moved through the dense tree line with the silent, fluid grace of a phantom. 10 minutes later, she reached the perimeter of the Russo estate. It was a formidable barrier, a 10-foot-high solid stone wall topped with wrought iron spikes and high-resolution infrared security cameras sweeping the tree line every 30 seconds. Beyond the wall lay an expanse of open lawn leading up to a massive, 3-story stone mansion. Quinn knelt behind a thick oak tree, observing the patrol routes. Silas hadn't just beefed up security, he had locked the place down. Through her NVGs, she spotted 2 heavily armed mercenaries walking the inside perimeter. An aggressive Doberman pulling tightly on a short leash. Distance to wall, 40 yards. Camera sweep interval, 30 seconds. Guard rotation, tight. Quinn waited for the camera lens to pan left. The moment it did, she sprinted across the open ground. She didn't slow down as she hit the stone wall. Using the momentum, she scrambled up the rough masonry, hooking a heavily padded grapple over the iron spikes to muffle the sound of metal on metal. She hoisted herself up, balancing precariously on the narrow stone ledge, hiding perfectly within the blind spot directly beneath the camera. Below her, the guard and his Doberman were approaching. Quinn reached into her tactical pouch and pulled out a small piece of raw steak she had grabbed from Carmine's club kitchen. Heavily laced with crushed, fast-acting sedatives, she tossed it lightly into the tall grass near the base of the wall. The Doberman stopped instantly, its ears perking up. It strained against the leash, pulling the guard toward the grass. The dog found the meat and swallowed it in one greedy gulp. "What have you got there, brute? Leave it," the guard grunted, yanking the leash. The dog took 2 steps and suddenly swayed, its legs buckling before it collapsed into the wet grass, snoring softly. The guard frowned, kneeling down, his hand reaching for his radio. "Command, my dog just..." He never finished the sentence. Quinn dropped from the wall like a stone, Leading with her boots, she slammed into the guard's shoulders, driving him face first into the muddy ground. Before he could even exhale, she locked him in a vicious triangle choke, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. He thrashed weakly for 4 seconds before going completely limp. Quinn dragged him into the thick manicured bushes, leaving the sleeping dog untouched. She was a mother. She didn't kill animals unless she had absolutely no choice. She scanned the massive courtyard. The mansion's windows were dark, but the perimeter lighting was blindingly bright, powered by a humongous industrial generator housed in a steel cage near the east wing. If she tried to breach the main doors in this lighting, Silas's snipers would pick her off before she took 10 steps. She needed to change the rules of engagement. She needed to drag them into her world, the dark. Quinn unslung the Mk-18 and moved rapidly from cover to cover, a stone fountain, a marble statue, a row of thick hedges, until she reached the generator cage. She pulled a block of C4 explosive from her vest, moldable like the clay Aaron used in art class. She packed it tightly around the generator's main power coupling, pressing a wireless detonator into the gray mass. She backed away, moving silently toward the heavy oak doors of the mansion's rear patio. Inside the compound's state-of-the-art security room, Silas was pacing like a caged tiger. He was sipping black coffee, his eyes glued to the mosaic of camera feeds. He had ordered 40 of his best men to surround the property. Vincent Russo was asleep in the master suite upstairs, confident that his fortress was impenetrable. Silas didn't share that confidence. His gut, a survival instinct honed over 20 years of wet work, was screaming at him. The baker wasn't dead, and she wasn't hiding. Alpha Team, report. Silas barked into his headset. Check in. Static. Alpha Team, respond. Silas yelled, his heart rate spiking. Suddenly, the security monitors flickered. Out on the patio, Quinn raised her left hand, holding the small black remote. She took a deep breath, visualizing the layout of the house. 3 cups of flour, 1 cup of butter. Predictable math. 1 pound of C4. 0 electricity. Total chaos. Quinn pressed the button. A thunderous explosion rocked the eastern side of the estate. The ground shook violently, and a massive fireball climbed into the rainy night sky, shattering the patio windows. Instantly, every single floodlight, every security camera, and every chandelier inside the mansion died. The fortress was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. In the security room, the backup emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, red glow over Silas's hardened face. He drew his sidearm, a cold smile touching his lips. She's here, Silas whispered over the tactical comms. NVG's on. Shoot to kill. Do not let her reach the 2nd floor. Outside, in the pitch black, Quinn kicked in the shattered remains of the patio doors and stepped into the grand foyer of Vincent Russo's mansion. Her night vision goggles hummed perfectly. Through the green lens, she saw 4 heavily armed mercenaries rushing down the grand staircase, sweeping their flashlights wildly in the dark. Quinn raised the Mk-18 to her shoulder, settling the holographic red dot squarely onto the chest of the lead man. The oven was preheated. It was time to bake. The grand foyer of Vincent Russo's estate was a cavernous space, designed to intimidate with its sweeping marble staircase, imported Italian tapestries, and a massive crystal chandelier that now hung dead and useless in the pitch black. Through the eerie, luminescent green glow of Quinn's quad-tube night vision goggles. The darkness was completely stripped away. To her, the foyer was as bright as noon. To the four mercenaries rushing down the stairs, sweeping the room with the frantic, narrow beams of their tactical flashlights, the darkness was absolute. They were dead before they even realized they were in a firefight. Quinn brought the short-barreled Mk-18 tied to her shoulder. She didn't spray wildly, she fired with the clinical, rhythmic precision of a metronome. Pop pop. The heavy SOCOM suppressor swallowed the roar of the 5.56 mm rounds, reducing them to sharp, mechanical clacks. The lead mercenary, a bulky man wielding a shotgun, took 2 rounds dead center in his level 3 body armor. The kinetic impact hit him like a sledgehammer, knocking him backward into the man behind him. Before the second man could untangle himself, Quinn transitioned targets seamlessly. Pop pop. 2 rounds found the exposed gap in the second man's armor. Just below his collarbone, he collapsed against the mahogany banister, sliding down the marble steps. Contact. First floor. The third man screamed, dropping to a knee and firing blindly into the foyer. Deafening, unsuppressed bursts of M4 fire chewed into the expensive plaster walls, sending clouds of white dust and shredded tapestry raining down. Quinn was already moving. She dropped low, sliding behind a massive, reinforced oak pillar near the coat check. She didn't return fire immediately. She let them panic. She let them empty their magazines into empty space. The muzzle flashes from their rifles bloomed like blinding white suns in her NVGs, temporarily washing out her vision, but they perfectly silhouetted the shooters. When the third man's rifle clicked empty, Quinn leaned out from the right side of the pillar. The laser sight of her Mk-18 sliced through the dark, resting directly on his forehead. Pop! He dropped instantly, his body tumbling down the remaining stairs to land in a heap on the marble floor. The fourth man, terrified and realizing he was outmatched by a ghost, didn't try to fight. He turned and bolted back up the stairs. Quinn let him run. He would lead her right to Silas. She moved out from cover, sweeping the muzzle of her rifle across the empty landing, checking the bodies to ensure they were neutralized. She moved with the fluid, heel to toe, operator glide, that kept her upper body perfectly steady. Every corner, every shadowed doorway was checked in a fraction of a second. Clear. Suddenly, her comms earpiece, looted from the guard outside, cracked to life. Bravo team, secure the east wing. Charlie team, fall back to the master suite and protect the boss. She's coming up the main stairs. I want a crossfire established on the landing. Now. It was Silas. His voice was calm, devoid of the panic his men were showing. He sounded almost excited. Quinn reached up and tapped the transmitter on her collar. Silas, she whispered, her voice a cold, localized breeze in his ear. I'm not coming up the main stairs. In the security room on the second floor, Silas ripped his headset off. His eyes widening, he drew his sidearm, a custom-machined 1911, and sprinted for the door. She's in the vents. Silas roared to the 2 guards stationed outside his door. Watch the ceilings. He was half right. Quinn wasn't in the ventilation shafts. That was a Hollywood myth. Industrial HVAC ducts were loud, cramped, and completely structurally unsound for a fully equipped human. She was in the dumbwaiter. While the mercenaries were setting up their fatal funnel at the top of the grand staircase, Quinn had slipped into the massive, commercial-grade kitchen on the first floor. She found the heavy-duty service elevator used to transport food to the private dining room upstairs. She hoisted herself into the cramped metal box, pulling the heavy grate shut. It was a tight fit with her plate carrier and rifle, forcing her to unsling the Mk-18 and draw her suppressed Glock 19. She found the manual override pulley and began hauling herself up, hand over hand, the oiled gears turning silently over the roar of the storm outside. Clunk! The dumbwaiter reached the second floor, stopping perfectly aligned with the wooden panel in the upstairs hallway. Through the thin slats, she could hear heavy boots running past, heading toward the main stairs. They were taking her bait. Quinn placed her boot flat against the wooden panel and kicked outward with piston-like force. The panel splintered inward with a loud crash, spilling Quinn out into the heavily carpeted hallway. She rolled forward, coming up to one knee, her NVGs painting the corridor in stark green contrast. Two heavily armed guards were standing 30 feet away, their backs turned to her, their weapons trained on the main staircase. They spun around at the sound of the crash. Quinn fired 4 times. Peefed, 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 peefed. Both men dropped silently to the thick carpet before they could pull their triggers. The hallway was clear. The master suite, a set of massive, double oak doors reinforced with steel banding, sat at the far end of the corridor. She holstered the Glock and brought the Mk-18 back up. She took 2 steps forward. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door to her immediate right, the library, exploded outward. A massive, armored figure tackled her through the splintered wood, driving his shoulder squarely into her chest plate. The sheer force of the impact lifted Quinn off her feet, slamming her violently against the opposite wall. The breath left her lungs in a sharp gasp, and the Mk-18 was knocked from her hands, skittering uselessly down the hallway. It was Silas. He didn't give her time to recover. Silas lunged forward, his heavy combat knife flashing in the dim emergency light. He thrust the blade toward her throat. Quinn reacted on pure, ingrained instinct. She didn't try to block the knife, she sidestepped the thrust, letting the blade bury itself an inch deep into the plaster wall next to her head. Before Silas could yank it free, Quinn drove her elbow upward in a brutal, crushing strike, catching him perfectly under the jaw. Silas grunted, his head snapping back, but he didn't go down. He was a veteran of 100 close-quarters fights. He released the knife handle, spun, and delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to Quinn's midsection. The ceramic plate in her vest absorbed the piercing damage, but the kinetic energy still fractured 2 of her ribs. Quinn stumbled backward, gasping for air, her vision swimming slightly. "You're good, Baker," Silas hissed, drawing his custom 1911 from his hip holster, his face bruised and bleeding in the red emergency light. "I'll give you that. You fight like a Force Recon ghost. But ghosts don't bleed." He raised the pistol, aiming center mass. Quinn didn't reach for her sidearm. It was too slow. Instead, she dropped to her knees, sweeping her leg out in a lightning-fast arc. Her heavy combat boot caught Silas squarely on the outside of his knee joint. Snap! The sound of Silas's knee completely giving way echoed in the hallway. He screamed, a guttural roar of agony, and collapsed, his shot going wild, burying itself into the ceiling. Before he could hit the floor, Quinn lunged forward. She grabbed the wrist holding the pistol, twisting it violently until she heard the bones in his forearm splinter. The 1911 dropped to the carpet. Quinn fluidly transitioned her grip, wrapping her legs tightly around his injured arm and locking him in a devastating armbar submission on the floor. She leaned back, applying maximum pressure. Silas thrashed, trying to reach his boot knife with his free hand, his face purple with pain and exertion. "It's over, Silas," Quinn whispered, her voice devoid of any emotion, the green glow of her NVGs making her look like a mechanical angel of death. "Tell them to stand down. Tell them to open the master suite doors." Silas spat blood onto the carpet, a defiant, ugly grin spreading across his face. "Go to hell, Baker. Russo pays me to kill, not to surrender. You're going to have to break my arm." Quinn didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She didn't offer a dramatic speech. She was a mother who had almost lost her child. She was out of mercy. She wrenched her hips upward, applying sudden, catastrophic torque. The sickening sound of Silas's elbow completely shattering tore through the air. Silas unleashed a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, his body going completely limp from the sheer shock of the pain. He passed out instantly, his eyes rolling back in his head. Quinn released the lock and stood up, wincing slightly as her fractured ribs ground together. She unholstered her Glock. Checking the magazine, she had a full clip. She stepped over Silas's unconscious body and walked toward the massive oak doors of the master suite. Behind those doors sat Vincent Russo, the man who had ordered the death of her family over a few crushed pastries. The fortress had fallen, the devil was trapped, and the baker was finally ready to serve the main course. The heavy oak doors of the master suite loomed before Quinn like the gates of hell. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, the cracked ribs from Silas's kick ground together with every inhalation. A sharp, stabbing reminder that she was running purely on adrenaline and maternal fury. She reached up and flipped her quad-tube NVGs up onto her helmet. She didn't need them anymore. From beneath the crack of the doors, a warm, flickering orange glow spilled out into the hallway. Quinn stepped back, raised her booted foot, and drove it perfectly into the space right next to the brass lock. The reinforced steel banding held for a fraction of a second before the wood around it catastrophically failed. The double doors burst inward with a deafening crash, slamming against the interior walls. Quinn pivoted into the room, her suppressed Glock 19 raised and steady. The master suite was the size of a small house. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, a roaring fire casting long, dancing shadows across the expensive Persian rugs and antique furniture. Sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair near the fire, calmly pouring himself a glass of amber scotch, was Vincent Russo. He didn't jump when the doors exploded. He didn't scream for the guards that were already dead or unconscious in his hallways. He simply finished pouring his drink, took a slow sip, and looked at the woman who had single-handedly dismantled his empire in less than 24 hours. Quinn kept the Glock aimed squarely at his chest. Moving slowly into the room, she checked her corners. Clear. It was just the two of them. "I have to admit," Russo said, his smooth, cultured baritone echoing in the quiet room, "when Silas called and told me a baker was dismantling my crew, I thought he had lost his mind. But looking at you now." He gestured vaguely with his glass to her soot-stained face, her bloodied tactical gear, and the cold, dead emptiness in her hazel eyes. "I see I was misinformed. You aren't a baker. You're a weapon. Stand up, Vincent," Quinn commanded, her voice a raspy whisper that cut through the crackling of the fire. Russo didn't move. He rested the crystal glass on a small mahogany side table. "Let's be businessmen about this. Miss Blake, I know who you are now. I made a few calls while my men were dying downstairs. Force Recon, 3 tours, Silver Star, honorable discharge. You wanted a quiet life. And you took it," Quinn said, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "Salva took it," Russo corrected smoothly, holding up a hand. "Salva was an idiot who didn't know how to read a room. I already killed him for his incompetence. We don't have to do this. You've proven your point. You've humiliated me, destroyed my property, and crippled my best men." Russo leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "Name your price. $1 million? $5 million? I can have it wired to an offshore account in 30 seconds. You take your daughter. You move to the Bahamas, and we both pretend this Tuesday never happened. You win. Take the money." Quinn stared at him. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the dirt, the sweat, and the absolute lack of mercy. She thought of Erin, crying in her oversized pajamas. She thought of the shattered glass covering her life's work. "My price," Quinn said quietly, "was a tray of macarons. $5,000 for protection." Sal said, "But you see, Vincent, I didn't need your protection. And you can't afford mine." Russo's eyes narrowed. The facade of the cultured businessman slipped, revealing the ruthless, cornered animal underneath. "You pull that trigger, and the rest of the commission will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Russo hissed, "You'll never stop running. Your kid will never have a normal life. The commission only respects power." Quinn replied evenly, "When they find you sitting in your own blood, surrounded by the ruins of your impenetrable fortress, they won't hunt me. They'll be terrified of the dark." Russo's right hand suddenly darted beneath the cushion of his leather chair. He was fast for an old man. He pulled a silver, snub-nosed .38 revolver, snapping it up to fire. He didn't even get to cock the hammer. Quinn squeezed the trigger of her Glock twice. Peefed, peefed. The suppressed rounds were clinically precise. The first hollow point shattered Russo's wrist, sending the silver revolver spinning into the fireplace. The second round caught him perfectly in the center of his forehead. Russo's head snapped back, his eyes rolled upward, the light instantly vanishing from them. He slumped heavily into the expensive leather chair, the crystal glass of scotch vibrating on the table next to him before going completely still. It was over. Quinn stood there for a long moment, the silence of the room rushing back in to replace the gunfire. She slowly lowered the Glock. The adrenaline began to fade, and the agonizing throb of her fractured ribs returned with a vengeance. She hissed in pain, clutching her side. She turned away from the dead king. Walking out of the master suite, she navigated the dark, silent hallways, stepping over the ghosts of the men who had underestimated a mother's wrath. By the time she reached the stolen sedan parked on the muddy utility road, the wail of distant police sirens was beginning to echo through the Weston Hills. The explosion at the generator had finally drawn their attention. Quinn stripped off the heavy tactical vest, the plate carrier, and the empty magazines, tossing them into the trunk. She pulled a clean, oversized gray hoodie over her soot-stained clothes, wincing as she pulled it over her ribs. She got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove back toward the city, leaving the war behind her. The sun was just beginning to peek over the Boston harbor, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and lavender. When Quinn unlocked the heavy steel door to Mrs. Higgins' apartment, the smell of old tea and lavender hit her like a physical wave of relief. She walked quietly into the living room. Mrs. Higgins was softly snoring in her armchair. On the sofa, tucked beneath the heavy wool blanket, was Erin. She was clutching her teddy bear, her chest rising and falling in a peaceful, rhythmic slumber. Quinn sank to her knees beside the sofa. She ignored the pain in her side, the bruises, and the blood beneath her fingernails. She reached out with a trembling hand and gently brushed a stray auburn curl from Erin's forehead. Erin stirred, her big brown eyes fluttering open. She blinked against the morning light, her gaze finding Quinn's face. "Mommy?" Erin mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Are the bad men gone?" Quinn felt a tear break free, tracking a clean line through the soot on her cheek. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her soul. The monster was put away in its box. The baker was back. "Yeah, Bug," Quinn whispered, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to Erin's warm cheek. "The bad men are gone. They're never coming back." Erin smiled, closing her eyes again, safe in the absolute certainty of her mother's promise. "Good. Can we make croissants today?" Quinn let out a soft, wet laugh, resting her forehead against the edge of the sofa cushion as the golden morning light washed over them. "Yeah, baby," Quinn whispered into the quiet room. "We're going to make the best croissants in the whole world."